Okay. For this mock exercise, we're going to take a look at cost volume profit analysis using a case called King Salmon sales. In this question, we're going to take a look at some concepts such as break-even, avoidable fixed cost. We're going to use some CVP. We're going to take a look at some pricing strategies and other assumptions such as operating risk. So let's take a look at the question. So this question, last year, the statement for King Salmon provided us with the following. So they gave us sales of 800,000. That's 100,000 kilograms. So we can probably figure out the sale price per kilogram. Then we're given a whole bunch of expenses: fish, smoking material, packaging material, labor wages, admin, and sales commission to give us an operating income of 90,000. The fishing season is only 3 to 4 months long, so labor costs are for employees who are college students and work in the summer. They're only hired as needed. So that kind of gives you a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of a hint that these costs are probably variable in nature. So the question is, the government is curtailing fishing because of the low fish count. So part A, this is the requirement. Because of this restriction, King Salmon sales can only buy 50,000 kilograms. Assume that the administrative cost incurred is only if this company sells salmon. Assume that the admin cost is incurred only if the company sells salmon. So that, to me, it's not a function of number of kilograms. It's the fact that if they're in the business of selling salmon, they're going to incur that admin. So to me, that's a fixed cost. Assume that managers will decide to operate if the company can at least break even should they operate this year. So the question is, we need to calculate the break-even sales. So remember, the government only restricts them to only buy 50,000 kilograms. So we need to know whether this quantity is above or below the break-even. So let's figure out the break-even quantity. So we need to categorize. So to do the break-even sales, we need to classify cost as either variable or fixed. So that's the first step we're going to do. So let's take a look at the cost. So I'm going to write down variable cost and fixed cost. There's two columns here. So the first expense is fish, and chances are, obviously, that would be variable, right? If we don't sell it, we don't need to incur the cost of fish. So that would be variable cost. What about smoking material? That's probably variable. Packaging. That's probably variable as well. Again, think about the concept. Without any fish to sell, we don't need to incur, obviously, fish, smoking material, or packaging material. What about labor? We're told that these are college students, and chances are, without work, we don't need them. So that's probably variable in nature. But it can be argued that it could be a combination of fixed and variable. But this question, we're going to assume they're all variable. Admin, we know that administration is the only fixed item because we're told that it says that assume that the administrative cost is incurred only if the company sells salmon. So if they're in the business of selling one salmon, they have to incur that administrative cost. And you've got sales commission, and that to me sounds like also a variable cost. So if I add my total variable cost is $560 and my total fixed cost is $150. All we're doing is we want to take the 710 and reclassify as fixed versus variable cost. That's what we're trying to do. In fact, the sum of these two is still 710. We're not changing, we're not adding, we're not creating more. Now, we're going to divide this by how many units of sale. We know that there was 100,000 kilograms sold. So this is the actual units. So we're going to divide this by 100,000 kilograms to give us $5.60 per kilogram. So our cost function, or total cost, is $560 times sale times number, right, in kilograms, plus fixed cost of $150. That's my cost equation. Now, remember, to break even, we need sales less variable cost less fixed cost. And break even is when its profit is zero, isn't it? So that means that we've got fixed cost of $150 equals the sales price. We know that this has got to be $8 per unit, right? That's the sales price. So we can at least calculate the contribution margin, which is sales of 8, subtract the variable cost of 560 times quantity. So Q is 150, which is fixed cost, divided by the per unit contribution, which is $2.40, to give us 62,500 kilograms. So if the government can only allow us to sell 50,000, so at 50,000 kilograms, then the king salmon cannot cover the fixed cost. So the break even is 62. The actual sales, or the limited number of sales that they can, is going to be less than the break even. That means it's not even covering for the administrative cost. So it doesn't make sense for the company to continue operating if they can only sell 50,000. Okay, so that's part A to the question. It's important for us, and if you think about what part A is asking, it's saying that should the company operate this year? Well, if we can only sell 50, we're going to figure out what is the minimum amount of activity, and that minimum amount of activity is the break-even point. Let's look at the part 2. Part 2 says, now assume that the admin cost continues regardless of whether the company sells salmon. Assume that the managers will decide to operate if the company can at least break even. Should they operate this year? Provide a calculation. So the question is, a term break even in this part of the question has a slightly different meaning in this part of the required. the break even in this question is basically asking us what is the best alternative. The best alternative. So right now at 50,000 kilograms, we're going to have a loss, right, of 8 minus $5.60 times 50,000 minus the fixed cost of 150 to give us a loss of 30,000. If the company incurs admin cost irrespective of whether they sell salmon or not, okay, they would lose out on about 150,000. So think about it. If they got to incur the admin cost anyway, right? So if they incur admin cost, regardless whether they sell salmon or not, they're going to lose 150, which is the admin cost, versus the $30,000 loss. So to me, this is a much better option. So the fact that this is lower, right, this is much less to the company, it makes sense for them. Therefore, it makes better sense for King to sell 50,000 kilograms of salmon as the impact to income of $30,000 loss is less than the 150 admin cost incurred. So this question asks us a little bit of a different way. It's really saying that if the admin cost still continues, regardless whether the company sells salmon or not, what should they do? Well, if they're going to incur this cost, but at 50 they're going to create a loss of 30, it's better because it's much less taxing on the bottom line. Okay, so that's part B to the question. Part C asked, break because the salmon shortage, suppose that the retail salmon price are increasing. What is the break even for King salmon? Assume that administration continues regardless of whether the company sells salmon or not. So what they're asking us for part C is how high can the sale price go up to break even? So we know that profit is 0, sales price is the unknown, minus variable cost of $5.60 times 50,000 kilograms, because that's the most they can sell because of the government restriction, minus the admin cost. So solving for the sales price, so 560 times 50,000 is 280,000 minus 150. So sales price equals 430 divided by 50,000. That's $8.60. So the sales price has to go up. So therefore, sales price must increase from $8 to $8.60 to break even. So part D, let's do into part D. Part D, it asked us, suppose that managers rely on the preceding CVP analysis to decide on whether to operate the business. What assumptions are they making? Well, the assumptions that we're making is the fact that the cost function, which is y equals, what was the cost function? $5.60 times number of kilograms plus 150, right? That's the cost function. We assume this is linear. We assume that linear and this is, right, and variable cost remains constant. And we also assume that it is, this cost function is within the relevant range of activities where the above is true. And we also have to assume that we can purchase at least 50,000 kilograms, because remember the government has put a cap on that. So we always have to assume that we can at least buy 50,000 to resell, and the sales price is $8.60. So in other words, we will have to make sure that the market price is competitive. Because what we'll find is if our competitors are selling it for less than $8.60, then at least at 50, we're not even breaking even. So that's part of the problem. So part D says, what are the assumptions? Well, we're going to assume that we can sell it for $8.60 and we're competitive, and we're also assuming that we can buy 50,000 units. Now, part E asked us, how reasonable are CVP assumptions listed in part D? So we're asking for reasonableness of the CVP assumption. So fixed cost is 150. We assume that the admin cost is all fixed. But is it really? Does it make sense? Is it exactly 150? I guess is the other question to ask, to better put it. Because these includes things like electricity, for example, that will vary with weather, electricity rates, and we're making that assumption that it's going to be fixed. So, right, because remember, we're assuming that the 150 does not change. Now, we're also going to assume that managers' salary is part of the 150. And of course, there was going to be some annual increases as well. So annual increases will vary year over year, and this is one of those ones where they may not have full control over these increases, right? So this is discretionary, difficult to control. So that's part, like remember, when CVP assumption, we're assuming that certain costs behave a certain way. But we know that when we start to look at, let's say, the administrative cost, we'll see that we know that part of that will include things like salary, electricity, and I just gave you two simple examples where that might not be exactly fixed. So it could be a function of variable and fixed. And maybe management may get a bonus, for example. So it could be part variable. Maybe it's a function of revenue. So it could be a fixed or variable, or a component of both. Now, the other items are variable cost. Again, we're going to assume that that varies with sales, right? Now, given the fact that there's a shortage of salmon, is King able to buy those salmon, is able to buy the fish at the variable cost of $2? So remember, shortage of salmon is the cost to buy remains at $2 per kilogram. And how did I get the $2? It was 200,000 divided by 100,000 kilograms, right? So that's the assumption, is we're going to assume that we can still get it for $2. Who knows? Given the shortage, it may go up. The cost may go up. So that's part of it too as well. So there's a lot of, so that's part of the problem is we use CVP, and we looked at CVP as a way for us to do a sensitivity analysis, a what-if analysis, a break-even analysis, help guides management decision-making process, but we make certain assumptions on variable and fixed, and oftentimes that assumption in the long run, and perhaps the short run, may not be true. Now, for part F, it's asking us, suppose that the owners of King Salmon asked you about the company's cost structure. Because volumes of fish fluctuates a great deal from one year to the next, the owner is wondering if some way can be found to reduce the risk of operating loss. So how do we do that? How do we decrease the risk of operating loss? The only way to do that, if you think about it, is we'll try to make most of our costs variable. Because with fixed costs, that's something we can't control, we can't change, and whether we sell 1 or 10 or 15 or 100 or 50,000 kilograms, that fixed cost will remain the same. So that's going to be part of the memo, right? So the memo will include a brief explanation of the risk associated with fixed cost in comparison to variable cost. And we also need to address how the risks relate to the fluctuation of business volume in actual sales can affect both the fixed and variable costs. So we know that fixed cost is fixed, but at what point in the level of activity will that assumption is no longer true? And of course, we saw from the earlier part D is that given the fact that there's such a shortage of fish, is the variable cost truly at $2 per fish, or is that going to go up as well because the demand for the number, the demand is outweigh the supply? So the only way to address this risk is perhaps try to convert most of that fixed cost into variable cost by making sure that the lower fixed cost will result in a lower break-even number of units. And that's the only way I could probably address it with King. So that would be the bulk of my memo, is trying to rationalize the fix, make it go lower, decreasing the break-even, And of course, that's how I would try to minimize the risk of loss. Okay? Thank you.